Hopefully, you all have the mystical floating can there. As it stands, it's floating in Photoshop transparency, which exists in neither time nor space. So we have to give this some kind of an environment into which it can live. And I'm just going to throw on a white background. I'm going to give it a little bit of a gradient to kind of simulate maybe like a white seamless paper, or a white formica or arborite, that kind of countertop material like the tables are made of. So I'm just going to throw on a white background. I'll just make a new transparent layer. I'll fill that with white. You could do a solid fill layer, whatever you want to do. Here's my white back. Oh, why is it? Where'd my can go? Why don't I see my can? Stacking order. You remember we're looking down through the stack. I see the background layer first. How do I make that my background? How do I put it so it looks like it's behind the can?
Drag it down.
And I just changed the stack. There we go. Oh, you've saved the day. Have you guys played around with gradients before? What is a gradient? Does it have to be gray? No, it's a transition from one thing to another. The gradient tool in Photoshop lets you do gradients between colors, but it doesn't even have to be like colors or brightness. Like, if anybody have a pet reptile, lizard? You have to have like a heat lamp at one side and it's cool on the other side, and you have what's called a thermal gradient. So a gradient is just a transition from one thing to another. Now, the gradient tool in Photoshop, let me just quickly run over how this thing works. If you hit G on the keyboard, it'll take you to the gradient tool. You guys ready? And by default, it goes to your foreground to background. So I've got red as my foreground, so I've got a red to white gradient. You can do foreground to transparent, black to white, any of these awesome gradients up here. And I'll just quickly show you how this tool works. I'll just do a black and white gradient here. And if I do a click and a drag, it'll start at the starting point, which in this case is black, and it'll end at the end point, which in this case is white. If this was a seamless background, you would probably expect a certain degree of fall off. Like, let's say the light is kind of shining on the back there. I don't want it necessarily to be black at the bottom, so I'll start below the document, and then you get kind of a grayishness up there. So the longer you drag, like the farther you drag, the softer that gradient is. When I started below and dragged way up, we got a very soft gradient. If I do a click and a short drag, we get a much harder gradient. If I barely do any drag, you get a really hard gradient. And you can play around with the angle. If you do it on an angle, you get an angled gradient. So the longer you drag, the softer the gradient. The shorter you drag, the harder the gradient. So I'm just going to throw some kind of a seamless looking, yeah, that looks pretty good around there. Now, if I had set this up on a set and I had like a spotlight shining down onto it, I'd probably have some of that darkening around the edges. What's that called again? Starts with a V? Some vignetting. I'm going to throw some of that on. Now, it doesn't need to be overly complex. Like for this here, for this background, I could really just make like a new transparent layer. I'll call it my vignette. And with a BHSB, big honkin' soft brush, maybe 10, 20% opacity. I'll just kind of brush some vignetting into there. You can do whatever you want. No, that's too much. Around there, okay. Now, shadows. If this really was sitting on a surface, you would expect that there would be some kind of a shadow or something. Let's talk about shadows for a second. If you're outside on a really sunny day, and maybe it's like later in the evening, so the sun's a little bit lower, and you see a shadow of yourself on the ground, you're casting a shadow. That's called a cast shadow. Do you have cast shadows on overcast days? Do you have any kind of shadow on an overcast day?
Yes.
Well,
very soft.
Sorry, very soft. Or what's called an ambient shadow. Like the lighting in the room right now, it's a very soft lighting, and if I look down, I do still have, I got a slight cast shadow, but I don't see any hard, I can't see my hands or anything. But there is always going to be some kind of darkening. Like if this is a fairly soft light coming in, we would expect that whatever light came from this side would get blocked from over here. But this side would get filled in by this light, so it wouldn't be too much of a shadow. And same deal over here. You'd expect some kind of darkening down below. I'm just going to throw some darkening down there. I'll make a new transparent layer. I'll call it the Ambient Shadow. So it's just kind of blocking the ambient light in the room. And I'm going to do it like really low opacity. Like here I did 2. There we go. And can I do that from the keyboard? Like if I do 6, I get 60%. If I do 2, I get 20%. But what if I do 0 too quickly? There's a really low opacity. And if I just kind of Doesn't need to be much of anything. It's just kind of a hint, a sense that there's some kind of shading going on there. And as you get closer to the object, it would get a little bit darker as it's blocking more and more of that light. Eventually, you would get to what's called a contact shadow. You ever heard the term contact shadow? When you make contact with something, like if you put your hands together, you'll see a thin black line right down the middle of your hands. But if you open them up, the black line is gone. What's causing that? Well, the light just can't get in there. If you're putting somebody into, like say you cut somebody out and you're putting them onto a sidewalk, you think, okay, well, they're standing right on the sidewalk. They're not going to be casting any kind of shadow like right under themselves, and yet they would be just a little bit. Where their shoes touch, there'll be a little bit of a gap where that light can't get under. We can simulate a contact shadow, same sort of deal, but it would be much smaller. Call this contact shadow. And maybe a slightly higher opacity. I just put a little bit of, this is where the light can't quite get underneath the can there. And maybe some of it should go onto the can itself. Right now I'm kind of below the can. I could drag the contact shadow so it's above. I could maybe focus it a little bit more on that edge in there. And the kind of shadows that you add would kind of depend on what sort of environment you're putting the can into. But you'll notice that those shadows just kind of help anchor it into the scene. That looks like it's kind of floating there. The shadows just kind of help anchor it down there. And if the light was coming more from one direction than the other, you might put a little bit of extra darkness on the other side. What else might this can have? Like if it was paper, seamless, you probably wouldn't expect any kind of reflection. But if it was the same kind of material as these desks, this Formica here, you might expect a bit of a reflection in there, mightn't you? Or if you'd photographed it on some acrylic, it could be a very hard reflection. Or if you photographed it on a mirror, you could have a slight double reflection. How could we make a reflection of this? What if I took my can and I duplicated it and flipped it, just kind of like spun it around? What if I did an edit, transform, I'll do a rotate 180 degrees. So now that it's there and I put it down below itself, is that what a reflection would look like? What did I do wrong? I did a rotate this way, and the ML is above the 330, and the 330 is above the, so it actually should be the other way around. So let me undo that, all right? So I've duplicated the layer, edit, transform, and I can flip it vertically about the horizontal axis, and there we go. And if I drag it down below, it looks exactly like what a reflection would look like, doesn't it? Or, well, does it? If this was sitting on the surface, look at what, this part of the can is touching the reflection, but this part isn't. It's almost like, if the two cans were, one was kind of tilted forward, there'd be a little gap on the sides, they'd be touching the middle, but it's not tilted, it's straight down. What would a reflection actually look like here? Well, opacity and some kind of distortion, but what kind of distortion? Like, a perspective. So if I had been looking downwards and I saw the top of the can and the can itself was kind of getting smaller as it went, the reflection wouldn't go out this way. It would actually keep getting smaller. Now in this case, you can see the top of the can is flat. The bottom of the can has a slight curvature to it, suggesting that the camera was at the same height as the top of the can, but we're looking downwards at the bottom of the can and we're getting that curvature. Now, the reflection, in a way, it would be like another can that continues even further down below the surface, and it too would have a curvature and kind of a smiley face. We got a little smiley face here, and now we have a frown. Frown's not good. Let me show you what an actual reflection would look like. Here's a picture someone took of a lens on some really crappy black acrylic. But look at what's happened. It's like we're looking downwards, kind of downwards at this part here. We're looking downwards at the back cap here. And oh, wait a minute, we're looking upwards into the reflection. It's almost like when you look down in front of a reflection, you're looking back upwards at the product. It's like an upside down version of the product. You're looking upwards into it. We see the underside ridge of this cap. We don't see it here because we're looking down on it. We're looking upwards onto this. Imagine a mirror and a spider standing on the mirror. If you look down at the spider, you're going to see the top of the spider. But if you look at the reflection, you're looking back up, you'll see the underside of the spider. So a reflection is a different angle than the actual product. Now we need to fake that, and by fake I mean it really will be fake, but I think we can make it look kind of similar. Now, we need to get this to come up into kind of that smiley sort of shape so that the bottom of the can touches itself the whole way across. Now, Photoshop does have some basic 3D capabilities, but they're like way beyond the scope of this class. So we're going to keep it pixel-based. We're going to keep it in what we can technically do. And I think if we were to generate a 3D cylinder and get a flat version of the label and wrap it on, it would look pretty illustrated. What if? Well, first off, I've got a little gap here. I'm going to move my can up a little bit higher so that the bum touches its own bum. There we go. Oh, except I've got my reflection above obviously the reflection should be below, so stacking order again. I'm going to drop that one layer down. So my reflection, and I'm going to name the layer reflection, and I'm going to call this one can. Never a bad idea to name your layers as you go. All right, so there's my reflection down there. Now this layer mask could cause problems. What if I were to grab the right side of the can here and do a transformation? There's a bunch of transformations available. Let me just quickly show you, first off, what could go wrong, but also what transformations available. Let's say I grab this right side of the can. I want to close up this gap. I want to bring this so that it touches itself the whole way across. If I did a transformation, I have, let's say, edit, transform. We've got a whole bunch of transformations here. What about skew? If I were to grab the side and skew, oh, I had the wrong layer selected. There's the reflection. Edit, transform. And a fast way to get to the transformations, if you do edit free transform, or the keyboard shortcut is Command T. So if you do a Command T and then right click inside the selection, there's all your transformations right there. So if I go to skew and I start moving up, oh, the image is moving right out of its layer mask. So I think this layer mask is going to cause problems. I'm going to right click and I'm going to apply the layer mask. So give that a try. Duplicate the layer, flip it vertically, bring it down so that it's below your can, move it up so that its bum touches its own bum, and then right click and apply that layer mask. Now we can take a marquee tool, I can select the right side, and if I do a skew, I could pull this bottom of the can up so it touches the whole way along. Now if I did it in one shot, let's say I took this side and I skewed it upwards. Could anything potentially go wrong? Well, let's find out. Do a Command T, right click, skew, and I pull this up until the bottom of the can touches itself. Well, yes, things could go wrong. This little curve here, it was got a little dent in it. This still has an overall frowny kind of face to it. It's not that smiley curve that we're looking for. What if I did it in multiple steps, though? Let me undo that. And what if I did a Command T, right click, skew, and I just watch this little area in, oh, I got to move that up even a little bit higher. That bum is not touching itself. There we go. Make sure you have a feather of 0. If you have a bit of a feather radius on there, it'll start to smudge the reflection, which isn't that bad of a thing because we're going to blur it anyway. But we'll just keep that feather radius at 0. I'm going to grab the right side of the can, Command T, right click, skew, and I heft this up, maybe that much, and I hit return. It's touching in there. Now this part isn't touching, so I will grab a little bit less, do a Command T. Remember before I went almost to the middle of the can there, do a skew, and I'll heft this upwards a little bit until it's just kind of touching itself. And then I'll grab a little bit less, do a Command T, right click, skew, pull her upwards. And it's still curving down on the edges, so I'll just keep grabbing more until the whole side looks like it's curving upwards in that smiley sort of face. So give that a whirl. Grab the marquee tool, Command T, right click, skew, and heft her up. And that gives the right side that kind of upward curve. And then, for extra fun, we'll do the same thing to the left side. Okay, so guys, now some people had some interesting questions over here. They were asking about the warp tool or liquefy. In theory, you could, like say you took the warp and you kind of grabbed and pulled the sides up. As long as you got everything exactly the same, it should work just fine. And same thing if you did like liquefy and you took like the forward warp tool and you put it right on the center here and brushed upwards. As long as you had the pressure and the density right, it should do the same sort of effect. I just find that with this, you can see exactly how much it's moving and you can get this kind of matching fine. And there'd also be like the real techno nerds who'd be like, well, if you download a copy of the Maya program for $1,500 and you make a cylindrical thing, you wrap that in, but we're not going there. Now this reflection here, if it was sitting on a mirror, and actually as we were talking about here, if you photograph something on a mirror, you may notice that you often get a double reflection. There is a type of mirror called a front silvered mirror where they put the silver on the front and you would get a reflection like this. Otherwise, if it was actually on like a regular mirror, you'd probably get something like this, kind of a double reflection where some of it reflects off the glass on the top of the mirror, and some of it reflects off the silver on the other side of the mirror. Or if you do like black acrylic, you can get just a single reflection as well. Now, the opacity. That looked a little bit better when I dropped the opacity, didn't it? Depending what the surface was, it probably wouldn't be a full intensity reflection. And I want to simulate that white arborite, like that kind of countertop material. So I'm going to bring the opacity down. And there's also this disturbing fact that it looks like half of the can has been cut off here. What do we do about that? Yeah, I would just use a layer mask and just kind of fade it out. We could crop the image, but a reflection, the farther it gets away from the can itself, it would kind of fade off into the distance. So what if I threw a layer mask onto here, took a paintbrush, and I just kind of blah, 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 blah. That kind of fades out a little bit. Remember on a layer mask, black hides, white reveals? Now again, this isn't necessarily exactly accurate. Like if this was a can and we were looking at a reflection, here we're looking down on the bottom of the can so we don't see the underside of this ridge. In the reflection, we would be looking up at the underside of the can. And really, we would see this where it kind of goes around and disappears behind the back of the can. We could try to paint in a little bit of extra stuff here, but you know what? If this was being reflected off of like some white arborite or formica, it would be soft and diffused anyway. Now, if we blur something, we're going to lose a whole lot of information, aren't we? Can we change a blur after we've done a blur?
Yes.
You're both right. If you do it to the pixels themselves, you cannot undo it. It's like when you scale something down, it's gone forever. But if you convert it to a smart object, you can do whatever you want to it because the smart object will always remember the original pixel information. So if I were to right-click on the name can copy here and convert this to a smart object, I could blur this without having to worry about messing up my information. So if I went under filter, blur, and I hit it with just say a little Gaussian blur there. Yeah, that's it sitting on that kind of white formica surface. And you'll notice that we now have a smart filter here with an eyeball, a Gaussian blur with an eyeball, and at the moment, turning off either of the eyeballs does the exact same thing because I only have one blur effect on there. But if I wanted to try some other stuff, like I'm like, hey, what if I put it on some brushed metal, some brushed aluminum? Well, if I did a filter, blur, motion blur, that might look like that kind of brushed metal sort of effect. I can play with the angle, the distance. Yeah, it kind of looks like it's sitting on some brushed metal there. Now I could turn off the motion blur, turn on the Gaussian blur. Which one looks better? Maybe I can do a combination of the two. So the smart filters meet the smart object, smart objectification, that sounds wrong. Anyway, means that you can do stuff to it without doing permanent changes. You could scale it down really, really tiny. You could scale it down to like 10 pixels wide. And then you could scale it back up and it would still remember all the original pixel information. So play around with that reflection. Give it some kind of an environment in which to exist